He was born in a ragged Bedouin tent deep in the unforgiving desert. He died bleeding in a storm drain, torn apart by the very people he had ruled. In between, he held the entire world hostage. To truly understand Muammar Gaddafi, we must strip away the caricatures and the propaganda. We have to examine the man in full, confronting both the undeniable achievements that elevated his nation and the profound atrocities that stained his legacy. In this narrative, a compelling three-dimensional portrait will emerge from the shadows of history. We will follow Gaddafi's extraordinary trajectory, exploring how a child born to an illiterate family managed to consolidate absolute power and transform himself into one of the most influential and unpredictable figures. We will examine the dark realities of his regime, including the chilling motives behind his orchestration of a devastating civilian airline bombing and the tragic circumstances of an American airstrike that claimed his young daughter's life. We will even uncover his surprising historical ties to the iconic 1990s rock band, the Cranberries. By the end of this journey, you will understand exactly why Muammar Gaddafi remains one of the most deeply polarizing, endlessly debated, and dangerous autocrats in modern history. Chapter 1: Bastard of the Desert. To understand Libya, one must first understand exactly where it sits on the map. It is often mistakenly lumped into the Middle East, pictured somewhere alongside Syria and Iran. In reality, Libya anchors North Africa. Bordered by Egypt to the east and Chad and Sudan to the south, its northern shores are washed by the Mediterranean Sea, gazing directly at Europe. In fact, Palermo, Naples and Rome are geographically closer to the Libyan coast than the Persian Gulf is. Almost all of Libyan life is squeezed onto a remarkably narrow coastal strip, ranging merely from 6 to 30 miles wide, spanning a distance no greater than a typical American daily commute. This sliver of land is the only place where measurable rain falls. Beneath it lie underground aquifers that sustain groves of olives, dates, and citrus. Of the nation's 7.5 million citizens, more than 7 million are concentrated right here in cities like Tripoli, Benghazi, and Sirte. Beyond this fertile crescent lies an endless sandy void stretching far beyond the horizon. 90% of Libya is pure desert. While the 20th century would see the discovery of massive oil reserves buried deep beneath those sands, that is a chapter belonging to its modern era. The ancient history of this land runs deep. For millennia, empires waged brutal wars for control of this lucrative coastline. It was a strategic foothold where ships could be built, maritime trade could flourish, and the precious commodities of the deep desert could be exported to the wider world. The Egyptians and Phoenicians laid claim to it, followed by the ancient Greeks, and inevitably the Roman Empire. They were eventually supplanted by the Byzantines and the Ottomans. By 1940, the year Muammar Gaddafi's story begins, Libya was under the control of another infamous autocrat, Benito Mussolini, a figure we explored in a previous episode of this series. Il Duce had long harboured delusions of resurrecting the Roman Empire. Since North Africa was once a vital province of ancient Rome, reclaiming these territories became an obsession for Mussolini. While he conquered some lands by force, Libya was inherited from the Italian kingdom, which had wrested it from the Ottoman Turks shortly before the First World War. By 1942, Libya was once again engulfed in the flames of global conflict, this time the Second World War. Although the North African campaign is often viewed as a secondary theatre of the war, tens of thousands of lives were extinguished in its shifting sands. Just as the relentless Russian winter dictated the brutal realities of the Eastern Front, in Africa, the ultimate authority was the unforgiving desert itself. The true terror of the desert lies not merely in the blistering heat, but in the violent swing of its temperatures. Days that soar well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit plunge to near freezing at night. Coupled with the relentless swarms of flies, scorpions, vipers, and the lethal disorientation of the shifting dunes, it is an environment where a single misstep means vanishing into the sands forever. The European colonial powers, particularly the Italians, viewed the native Bedouins who navigated this harsh landscape with profound contempt. Long before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Italian regime orchestrated a brutal campaign in Libya that meets the modern definition of genocide. General Rodolfo Graziani, infamously dubbed the Butcher of Fezzan, forced nearly 110,000 people into concentration camps. Tragically, half of those imprisoned, comprising entire nomadic tribes, never survived the ordeal. It was at the height of the Second World War, amidst the filth, disease, and sweltering heat of this unforgiving landscape, that a frail pregnant woman went into labour. Named Aisha in honour of the Prophet Muhammad's third wife, she belonged to the Kadadfa tribe. In a traditional nomadic tent, she gave birth to a boy they named Muammar, a name that translates to the long-lived. He would go on to live for 69 years, a reality that sharply contrasts with modern hip-hop artists like Big Baby Tape, who have used Gaddafi's name as a symbol for living fast, fundamentally misinterpreting the dictator's long, drawn-out grip on life. Before delving further, it is crucial to understand that Gaddafi's entire biography is shrouded in myth and contradiction, beginning with his birth. Historians cannot definitively say whether he was born in 1942 or 2 years prior, as the Bedouins kept no written record. However, they have traced his birthplace to the remote outskirts of Sirte, a strategic port city near the centre of Libya. Today, much of Sirte lies in ruins after years of civil war, echoing the devastation it faced 80 years ago when British and Italian forces clashed over its harbour, leaving locals to hide in their tents and pray the artillery shells would land elsewhere. Gaddafi's father was a humble camel and goat herder. Years later, when Muammar held absolute power, he would proudly declare himself a son of the desert, perhaps to project a populist image or simply to mask any lingering shame over his impoverished roots. Yet, a far more intriguing theory emerged in 1977 from a French intelligence officer. During a meeting between Gaddafi and the president of Niger, the Libyan leader discovered the officer was Corsican and casually remarked that he too was somewhat Corsican. This cryptic comment was likely a reference to Albert Preziosi, a free French pilot who crashed in the Libyan desert in 1941. Bedouins nursed the wounded pilot back to health, and rumours persisted that he had an affair with a local woman named Aisha. While the truth of this romance remains unverified, the physical resemblance between the pilot and the dictator is undeniable, right down to the shape of their noses and facial structures. Legend even claims that when Preziosi's mother first saw Gaddafi on television, she cried out that it was her Albert. Regardless of his true paternity, Muammar remained an only son, an extreme rarity in Bedouin culture, where families were typically large and where the staggering 30% infant mortality rate meant 1 in 4 children never saw their first birthday. Gaddafi grew up in grinding, abject poverty, severe even by Bedouin standards. His family constantly drifted across the dunes in search of grazing land, offering the boy no stability and no social circle beyond the relentless sun and the caravan's path to the next watering hole. However, at the age of 9, his illiterate parents forced him into the social elevator of formal education. He essentially lived on the floor of that elevator, often sleeping in mosques or on the streets. He later claimed to walk 40 miles round-trip across the desert every weekend just to visit his family. Though the colonel was prone to inflating his own mythos, the core truth of his destitution was real. At school he was bullied mercilessly by city boys who, while poor, were not destitute. The ragged Bedouin boy with his brooding demeanour and thick rural accent was a profound outsider. Decades later, CIA analysts building a psychological profile of the Libyan leader would note that Gaddafi learned early on how to transform deep shame into fierce pride, weaponizing his rock-bottom origins as a badge of honour. The family eventually settled in Seba, a rare oasis city deep in the Sahara. This isolation paradoxically connected Gaddafi to the broader world, as it was here he found like-minded friends and was taught by Egyptian expatriates. To understand the significance of these Egyptian teachers, one must look at the geopolitical landscape of the late 1940s and early 1950s. Most regional nations were still tethered to European empires. Egypt and Iraq were nominal monarchies heavily manipulated by London, while France maintained a tight grip on Syria, and the Arab-Israeli conflict was igniting in the British Mandate of Palestine. The local populations were boiling with resentment, questioning why their rulers lived in opulence while the masses suffered, and why Western powers controlled their resources. Libya was no exception. Administered by an Anglo-French military coalition after Italy's defeat, the nation was eventually handed over to King Idris I. He was a monarch who suited Western interests perfectly, but alienated his own people and the broader Arab world, whose cultural epicenter was Egypt. Against this backdrop, Gaddafi's Egyptian teachers handed the young boy 5 ideological torches that he would eventually use to set Libya ablaze. A fierce resentment of colonizers, a deep disdain for puppet monarchs, a staunch opposition to Israel, a passionate call for Islamic revival, and above all, a vision of Arab socialism that promised justice and equality for the poor. In 1952, young Muammar watched in awe as Gamal Abdel Nasser led a group of young military officers to overthrow the Egyptian king. Nasser soon seized the Suez Canal, an act of sheer audacity akin to a foreign power taking over the Panama Canal under the nose of the United States. Britain, France, and Israel attempted to take it back by force, but were thwarted when the United States and the Soviet Union, in a rare Cold War alignment, intervened to prevent a Third World War. Nasser emerged as a hero across the Arab world, proving that blending pan-Arabism, socialism, and anti-imperialism created an explosive mixture capable of forcing global superpowers to yield. This triumph sparked a chain reaction of bloody coups in Iraq and Syria. Gaddafi was intoxicated by this revolutionary fervour, believing with absolute certainty that it was his destiny to carry Nasser's torch. His reactions to global events were highly volatile. When the Pan-Arab project faltered, an 18-year-old Gaddafi organised protests and smashed the windows of a local hotel selling alcohol, leading to his family's expulsion from the city. Forced to relocate and finish his schooling elsewhere, the fiery youth dove headfirst into the political underground. By the age of 20, Gaddafi was just another angry young Arab dreaming of changing the world. The critical difference, however, was that this impoverished desert nomad would actually succeed, eventually executing what is arguably the cleanest coup in modern history. Chapter 2: The Perfect Coup. In the early 1960s, a seeming miracle occurred beneath the unassuming sands of Libya. Prospectors struck vast reserves of oil, a discovery that by all logic should have lifted the nation out of its grinding poverty. Yet, the wealth never trickled down. Under the reign of King Idris, the average annual income for a Libyan citizen hovered around a mere $30 in modern terms, a figure comparable to, if not worse than, the poorest nations on the African continent. Instead of filling the national treasury, the influx of petrodollars quietly pooled in the private coffers of the king and his inner circle. Guarding such immense newfound wealth, however, required a formidable military, and the royal government faced a severe manpower shortage. Out of desperation, they began recruiting practically anyone who met the minimum requirement of a high school education. In their haste, the authorities enlisted individuals with known anti-government sentiments, including a young Muammar Gaddafi. Had the Libyan ruling class looked up from their ledgers for a moment to observe the shifting political winds in neighbouring Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, they would have seen the writing on the wall. Across the post-colonial Arab world, military coups were becoming the standard mechanism for regime change. In these nascent states, the army was often the only institution possessing the discipline, weaponry, and organisational muscle to seize power, particularly when local police forces were weak and easily corrupted. It was within this volatile environment in the mid-1960s that a young communications lieutenant named Muammar Gaddafi quietly assembled an underground revolutionary cell of roughly 70 men. They called themselves the Free Officers Unionist Socialists. The first half of the moniker was a direct homage to the revolutionary group led by their idol, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. The term unionist reflected a deep-seated belief in pan-Arab unification and the expulsion of colonial powers, while socialists tapped into a widespread regional desire for basic economic justice. Much like the ideological adaptations seen in other mid-century revolutions, this flavour of socialism had very little to do with the rigid doctrines of Marx or Lenin. It was simply a political icebreaker, a populist banner under which to rally the masses. Operating with strict compartmentalization, the cells functioned semi-autonomously. Members only knew their immediate peers, keeping the true leadership shrouded in secrecy. Gaddafi personally vetted every recruit, requiring them to swear an oath of loyalty on the Quran. Despite these precautions, their activities did not go entirely unnoticed. Egyptian intelligence, who tacitly supported the young radicals, caught wind of them, as did the CIA. American intelligence officers were actively monitoring the Libyan military to protect their alliance with the king. However, the CIA's attention was fixed on a different faction of older, more established conspirators known as the Black Boots. To the Americans, this veteran group appeared to be the only credible threat, and they entirely dismissed the 27-year-old Captain Gaddafi as a peripheral nuisance. For 5 years, the young captain and his loyalists meticulously planned their takeover. To them, King Idris was a weak, aging figurehead approaching 80, a man far more interested in retreating to his luxurious villas than governing a modernizing nation. To win the support of the public, the conspirators needed a powerful rallying cry, which they found in the glaring presence of foreign military bases on Libyan soil. The primary target of the Libyan opposition's ire was Wheelus Air Base, a massive American installation established in the late 1940s as a strategic foothold against the Soviet Union. Covering an area larger than the entire country of Monaco, it housed thousands of American military personnel and their families. In the event of a nuclear conflict, American bombers were slated to launch from these sun-drenched shores to strike the Soviet bloc. Similar British and French outposts dotted the country, alongside a deeply entrenched population of approximately 20,000 Italians. These descendants of Mussolini's colonial era still controlled the most lucrative agricultural lands and coastal businesses. For Gaddafi's nationalist officers, the justification for a coup was clear and undeniable. By the summer of 1969, whispers of an impending military takeover echoed through the streets of Tripoli and Benghazi. Yet, the establishment was bracing for a strike by the Black Boots, not Gaddafi's free officers. Amidst this simmering tension, King Idris made the fateful decision to travel to Turkey for medical treatment blissfully unaware that he would never set foot in his homeland again. Exhausted by his reign, the king had already scheduled his formal abdication in favour of the crown prince for September 2nd. Gaddafi, however, decided to rewrite the royal calendar. He resolved that on Monday, September 1st, Libya would begin a new era. In the early hours of that morning, Gaddafi executed what was arguably one of the most flawless, bloodless military coups in modern history. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the 27-year-old gave the signal. His 70 operatives mobilized simultaneously across Tripoli and Benghazi, launching Operation Al-Quds, named after the Arabic word for Jerusalem. Gaddafi personally led the charge in Benghazi, swiftly capturing the Burqa barracks, the city's primary military installation. In rapid succession, his men secured airports, police stations, radio towers, and government buildings. When confronted with the business end of an assault rifle, the Crown Prince enthusiastically agreed to surrender his claim to the throne. In a stroke of dark historical irony, the CIA's initial assessment had not been entirely wrong. The Black Boots were indeed finalising their own coup, scheduled for September 5th. Gaddafi simply beat them to the punch by 4 days. When Gaddafi's forces raided the home of one of the rival conspirators, the groggy officer yelled at them, calling them idiots, and insisting that the coup was not supposed to happen that day, mistakenly believing his own men had jumped the gun. By 4 o'clock in the morning, a mere 2 hours after it began, the operation was complete. Only one royal guardsman, who had refused to lay down his weapon, lost his life. When the sun rose, 2 million Libyans awoke to find themselves living in a fundamentally different country. Yet, for the first few weeks, neither the Libyan public nor the international community had any idea who was actually in charge. On September 2nd, a newly formed Revolutionary Command Council officially abolished the monarchy, declaring the birth of the Libyan Arab Republic under the motto of freedom, socialism, and unity. To maintain his operational security, Gaddafi deliberately fed the press a false rumour that the mastermind was a high-ranking military attaché stationed in Rome. While global intelligence agencies chased this phantom colonel, Gaddafi quietly consolidated his grip on the nation, methodically neutralising any remaining pockets of resistance. Once his authority was secure, Captain Gaddafi promoted himself to the rank of colonel, mirroring the title of his hero, Nasser. The rank was a calculated psychological tool. It signalled to the enlisted men that he was a fellow soldier, not a distant aristocratic general. To the broader public, it projected the image of a humble servant of the revolution rather than a power-hungry dictator. Yet, behind this facade of soldierly modesty lay absolute, unchecked power. He assumed the role of commander-in-chief, meaning a mere colonel was suddenly issuing orders to the nation's top generals. Eventually, he would shed traditional military titles altogether, adopting the singular grandiose moniker of brotherly leader of the revolution. At just 27 years old, Gaddafi had conquered a nation. To put that age into perspective, at 27, Mao Zedong was an obscure rural teacher, and Leon Trotsky was facing exile in Siberia. It is the exact age at which cultural icons like Jimi Hendrix and Kurt Cobain met their tragic ends. Gaddafi, by contrast, had seized control of a rapidly modernizing, oil-rich state. The international response was a mixture of pragmatism and cautious optimism. The Soviet Union eagerly recognized the new regime, lured by the inclusion of the word socialism in their revolutionary motto. While Western powers were initially shocked, they were well accustomed to post-colonial regime changes. Both the United States and Britain swiftly extended diplomatic recognition, desperate to secure their continued access to Libyan oil and military bases. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Nasser was overjoyed, viewing the young upstart as his ideological heir. When Nasser passed away a year later, Gaddafi would stand by his casket, playing the role of the devoted protégé mourning his master. Domestically, the revolution was met with overwhelming enthusiasm, particularly among the urban youth. They harboured deep resentments against the corrupt monarchy and the lingering colonial presence, and they eagerly embraced the new regime's promise of rapid, sweeping change. Gaddafi wasted no time delivering on those promises. His first decisive act was to dismantle the foreign military presence. The British were ordered out, swiftly followed by the Americans. Tens of millions of dollars worth of infrastructure at Wheelus Air Base was handed over to Gaddafi's forces without a fight. June 11th was declared a national holiday, proudly designated as the day of the evacuation of American troops. Next, he turned his sights on the remaining Italian population. Although they constituted a mere 2% of the population, they controlled a wildly disproportionate share of the nation's wealth and economic infrastructure. Just 1 month after the coup, the Revolutionary Command Council issued a sweeping decree that effectively nationalised all Italian-owned property. With their land and livelihoods confiscated by the state, the remaining settlers were forced to flee. With breathtaking speed, the 27-year-old Bedouin had cleared the political board. In just 6 months, he had evicted the colonial powers, dismantled the monarchy, and expelled foreign militaries, leaving all potential rivals either exiled or subjugated. It was, without question, the most flawless beginning for any autocrat in the 20th century. Gaddafi had ascended the mountain unscathed, entirely dressed in white, both literally and metaphorically. The only major hurdle left to conquer was the very resource that made Libya matter to the rest of the world, its oil. Chapter 3. The Seven Sisters and the Colonel in Upton Sinclair's classic American novel Oil, which later inspired the acclaimed film There Will Be Blood. The underlying thesis is unmistakable. Oil is the lifeblood of the modern world. It is the fluid that courses through the veins of our machines, our factories, and our entire global economy. It is also the very reason blood is so casually spilled for the right to control its flow. It is no historical accident that a 27-year-old colonel named Muammar Gaddafi did not just seize control of any impoverished African republic. He captured a nation sitting atop the largest petroleum reserves on the continent. By 1970, Libya was pumping a staggering 3.4 million barrels of oil every single day. Within the Arab world, only Saudi Arabia produced more. For a nation with a population of barely 2 million people, this was the geopolitical equivalent of winning the lottery. The only remaining question was who would actually get to cash the ticket. At the time, the global petroleum industry was dominated by a cartel of Western conglomerates, famously known as the Seven Sisters. By the late 1960s, these corporate behemoths had cornered 85% of the world's oil reserves. To put it simply, they dictated the prices, they decided where and how much black gold was pumped, and they kept the lion's share of the profits, leaving the host nations with a meagre 50% cut. If a host country objected to these terms, the cartel's response was a polite but firm invitation to try drilling and selling the oil themselves. Gaddafi, however, intended to rewrite the rules of the game. Having promised his people that Libya's wealth would finally belong to Libyans, he knew he had to force foreign entities to operate on his terms. His initial target was not one of the mighty Seven Sisters, but a smaller, independent Western operator, Occidental Petroleum. Founded by the entrepreneurial son of a Russian immigrant, the company had struck the jackpot in the 1960s, securing lucrative Libyan concessions that promised endless wealth for minimal continued investment. Gaddafi's revolution turned that dream into a nightmare. The colonel executed his squeeze with calculated precision. First, he ordered Occidental to drastically cut its production, citing the need to preserve national reserves. As the company began bleeding millions of dollars, Gaddafi raised the stakes, demanding a significantly larger share of the revenue per barrel. In desperation, Occidental executives pleaded with the Seven Sisters for support, but the major players brushed them off, content to let a stubborn independent competitor drown so they could eventually absorb its market share. Isolated and hemorrhaging cash, Occidental caved to Gaddafi's demands. It was the pebble that started a global avalanche. Gaddafi systematically approached the remaining oil companies, applying the exact same playbook. Forced production cuts, the looming threat of total nationalization, and a blunt ultimatum demanding a larger cut of the profits, simply because Libya had the leverage to do so. This was not a bluff. Libyan crude was considered some of the finest in the world, categorized by the industry as light and sweet, making it highly desirable and easily refined. One by one, the Western oil conglomerates surrendered. By April 1971, the Tripoli Agreement was signed, and the price of Libyan crude exploded from 90 cents to $3.50 a barrel, a nearly four-fold increase. The global market was entirely unprepared for such a violent shock. The ripple effects were instantaneous. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait and Iran watched in awe as an upstart, 20-something desert colonel brought the titans of Western industry to their knees. This newfound leverage set the stage for the Yom Kippur War in 1973. When Western nations backed Israel against attacking Egyptian and Syrian forces, the newly emboldened Arab oil states retaliated with a devastating embargo. Oil prices did not just skyrocket, they left the stratosphere entirely. The United States was suddenly plunged into its most grueling economic crisis since the Great Depression, characterized by crippling gas lines, airline bankruptcies, and runaway inflation. Conversely, oil-producing nations, including the Soviet Union, found themselves drowning in an unprecedented flood of petrodollars, a false comfort that would ultimately contribute to the Soviet collapse a decade later when prices inevitably crashed. Gaddafi had inadvertently triggered a global paradigm shift, ushering in the era of the petrodollar, and he was more than happy to reap the rewards. Before his coup, Libya's oil revenues hovered around $1 billion annually. In just over 4 years, that figure quintupled, even as the nation's actual oil production was cut in half. Libya was selling significantly less oil, but making exponentially more money. It was the economic equivalent of slashing your work week to 2 days, while your boss multiplies your salary by 5. As oil prices surged, so did the standard of living for the average Libyan. In its golden years, the purchasing power of a Libyan citizen rivaled and often exceeded that of the middle class in highly developed Western nations. To put this in perspective, during the mid-1970s, an average American family was stretching every dollar just to afford basic groceries and gasoline amid crushing stagflation. Meanwhile, a typical Libyan worker suddenly had the disposable income to purchase hundreds of pounds of premium meat or imported goods every month, an unimaginable luxury for a population that had been among the poorest on earth just 15 years prior. This limitless influx of cash gave Gaddafi a blank check to reshape his society. He aggressively funded public education, driving the national literacy rate from a dismal 25% to over 83%. New universities were constructed, and radically for the Arab world at the time, half of the enrolled students were women. Gasoline became cheaper than bottled water. The state established free, high-quality healthcare and childcare systems, even covering all expenses for citizens who required specialized medical treatment abroad. Naturally, The reality of Gaddafi's Libya was not the utopian paradise often romanticized on the internet today. The widely circulated claim that the state handed every newlywed couple $50,000 was technically on the books, but practically impossible to actually collect. Similarly, electricity was not entirely free, though the heavily subsidized rates were incredibly low. Yet, when analysing the sheer scale of the Libyan economic miracle, it is hard not to feel that Tripoli was poised to become the Dubai of North Africa, a gleaming oasis willed into existence from nothing. Tragically for Libya, Gaddafi chose to play the role of the insatiable fisherman's wife from the classic fable. He simply did not know when to stop. The borders of his prosperous nation soon felt too confining. Following the death of his idol, Egyptian President Nasser, Gaddafi convinced himself that the mantle of Arab leadership had passed directly to him, and he became obsessed with forcing the entire world to bow to his vision. Chapter 4. The Green Book. In 2018, Peter Farrelly's cinematic drama Green Book captured the Academy Award for Best Picture. The film took its title from a very real, historical survival guide that directed black Americans to safe motels, gas stations and restaurants as they navigated the perilous landscape of the Jim Crow South. Muammar Gaddafi had a green book of his own. While the American guide was designed to help its readers survive an inherently unjust world, the Libyan dictator's manifesto was an ambitious blueprint to entirely remake the world in his image. Published in the late 1970s, Gaddafi's Green Book outlined what he proudly declared the Third Universal Theory, a sweeping ideological alternative to both Soviet communism and American capitalism. Modestly referring to his work as the gospel of the 20th century, the text became a direct reflection of his worldview. Nearly everything he would subsequently do to his country, from his most idealistic reforms to his most egregious atrocities, sprang directly from these pages. His first major initiative was to completely dismantle the traditional structure of the state. According to his design, true power would belong directly to the masses. He abolished political parties, parliaments, and all conventional institutions of representative democracy. In their place, he established people's congresses, mandating the participation of every adult citizen. This grassroots system was designed to flow from the bottom up. Local committees, organized at the level of individual apartment blocks, theoretically held the power to shape national and even foreign policy. Their decisions would be passed up to district congresses, then city congresses, and finally to the national level. Yet, there was a glaring omission at the absolute pinnacle of this supposedly egalitarian pyramid. Gaddafi himself formally resigned from all official government posts in 1977. Instead, he adopted the nebulous title of brotherly leader and guide of the revolution. By shedding any formal title, he brilliantly inoculated himself against being ousted. It is politically impossible to legally remove a man from a position he does not officially hold. This semantic sleight of hand became his ultimate instrument of absolute control. While he possessed no constitutional authority on paper, every critical decision in Libya originated with the colonel. He would simply mandate his desires from the shadows and allow them to bubble up through the local committees disguised as the spontaneous will of the people. To ensure this theatrical performance ran smoothly, he deployed revolutionary committees, a sprawling network of informants and enforcers acting as his eyes and ears on every floor of this bureaucratic edifice. He had successfully engineered a state without a state. 4 years after his initial coup, Gaddafi had launched a sweeping cultural overhaul known as the Popular Revolution. This initiative rested on 5 uncompromising pillars. First, all existing laws were suspended and replaced by arbitrary revolutionary decrees. Second, the state declared that all political opponents were to be physically eliminated, dismissing any notion of re-education or rehabilitation. Third, the general populace was to be armed to defend the revolution. Fourth, he ordered sweeping purges of anyone who rejected the Green Book, targeting communists, conservatives, capitalists, and atheists alike. Finally, he mandated the complete purification of Libya from what he deemed poisonous foreign influences. The brutality of this system quickly became apparent. When university students dared to stage protests, government forces violently dispersed them, resulting in mass beatings and imprisonments. A year later, on the anniversary of those protests, the regime publicly hanged several student leaders before an audience of thousands, broadcasting the executions on state television. Gaddafi christened it the Day of Judgment. From that point forward, April 7th became a grim annual tradition of televised state-sponsored executions. Any unsanctioned political or social activity, even benign volunteer work or mild criticism of the Green Book, carried the risk of imprisonment or death. Fleeing the country offered no protection, as Gaddafi deployed international assassination squads to eliminate dissidents across London, Rome, and the broader Middle East. The colonel's heavy hand extended far beyond his political rivals, profoundly micromanaging the daily lives of ordinary citizens. In a disastrous economic pivot, he outlawed private retail and rental housing, replacing local shops with massive state-run people's supermarkets. While the stated goal was to eliminate price gouging, the reality was catastrophic supply chain failure, resulting in empty shelves and a level of consumer deprivation that rivaled the bleakest days of the Soviet bloc. In another deeply misguided initiative, Gaddafi ordered citizens to achieve agricultural self-sufficiency by breeding chickens on their apartment balconies. One only has to imagine the deafening cacophony and unbearable stench echoing through a densely packed concrete high-rise during a sweltering 100-degree North African summer to grasp the absurdity of the decree. As if to ensure that everyday life was entirely stripped of joy, Gaddafi outlawed boxing and all forms of wrestling. Even soccer, while technically permitted, was heavily censored. Broadcasters were forbidden from uttering the players' names, referring to them only by their jersey numbers. Western music was strictly criminalized. Throughout the 1980s, the regime staged public bonfires to burn guitars, saxophones, and drum kits, condemning them as poisonous distortions of authentic Arab heritage. Despite this cultural puritanism, Gaddafi was not a radical Islamist. In fact, he deeply feared fundamentalists as potential rivals for his absolute power, ruthlessly suppressing any religious movements that threatened to cross his established lines. With each passing year, the colonel's megalomania expanded. Having grown bored with merely dominating Libya, he set his sights on becoming the undisputed leader of the entire Arab world. On paper, unifying 22 nations, sharing a common language, religion and history seemed like a grand, achievable vision. In reality, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East was highly fractured. It functioned much like a chaotic corporate conference call, where every participant is shouting over the others, half the executives have muted the rest, and there is absolutely no moderator. Gaddafi relentlessly pursued unification treaties with Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Sudan, and Chad. Each attempt followed the same agonizing pattern: initial diplomatic progress, followed by inevitable collapse, leaving the colonel isolated and ignored. Frustrated by these constant rejections, Gaddafi embraced a radical new worldview. He concluded that his fellow Arab leaders were cowards and traitors, entirely subservient to Western interests. He was particularly incensed by Egypt's historic 1979 peace treaty with Israel. Believing himself to be the only pure leader left, he famously attended an Arab League summit in Algeria, wearing a single white glove, explicitly stating that he refused to let his bare skin touch the blood-stained hands of his colleagues. Driven by this righteous indignation, Gaddafi decided that any faction anywhere in the world that was willing to take up arms against the West and its allies deserved his unwavering support. Funneling millions of petrodollars into weapons and safe havens, the visionary colonel transformed himself into the world's premier sponsor of global chaos. Chapter 5. Fighters and Killers. Until the 1970s, the concept of international terrorism was largely foreign to the global public. That decade changed the geopolitical landscape forever. A wave of violence swept the globe from the Munich Olympics massacre to the kidnapping and execution of the former Italian Prime Minister by the Red Brigades. In Spain, Basque separatists assassinated the head of government, while in Northern Ireland, a brutal street war erupted between British troops and the Irish Republican Army. Remarkably, the IRA was receiving direct support from Muammar Gaddafi. To the casual observer, the alliance between a North African autocrat and Irish militants made little sense. When pressed by journalists on whether his support for a righteous cause justified the bombing and maiming of innocent civilians, Gaddafi dismissively deflected, claiming he was not responsible for the methods his beneficiaries chose to employ. The reality was that Gaddafi funded terror for three distinct reasons. First, he had the financial means. A few $1,000,000 diverted from his vast oil revenues went entirely unnoticed in the national budget. Second, he craved outsized global relevance, desiring to project power far beyond his borders. Finally, he viewed himself as leveling the playing field against the United States and the Soviet Union, reasoning that if the Cold War superpowers could fund their own armed proxies, Libya had every right to do the same. To understand the spectrum of militant groups Gaddafi bankrolled, one might visualize a scale of radicalism akin to the Scoville heat index for peppers. At the foundational level were groups like the Basque ETA or the IRA. They engaged in targeted political violence, assassinating officials and bombing pubs. But their violence was somewhat contained compared to the second tier. This mid-level included massive organizations like Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization or the African National Congress in South Africa during the apartheid era. These were groups that operated on a massive scale, blurring the line between freedom fighters and terrorists depending on the geopolitical observer. Gaddafi, naturally, cared nothing for this distinction. At the absolute apex of this scale were the pure extremists, the human equivalents of weaponized pepper spray. The most notorious among them was the Abu Nidal organization, led by a man widely considered the world's most dangerous terrorist prior to Osama bin Laden. Days before Christmas in 1985, Abu Nidal's operatives opened fire on civilian passengers at the Rome and Vienna airports, leaving 19 dead and over 140 wounded, including many children. The Libyan Foreign Ministry did not simply ignore the massacre, they officially praised the slaughter as a heroic act. Gaddafi funded them all, leftists and right-wingers, communists and Islamists, the Shining Path in Peru, rebels in the Philippines, the Japanese Red Army, and Malcolm X's Nation of Islam in America. He occasionally financed opposing sides of the exact same conflict. Libya effectively became an international terrorist retreat, a safe haven where militants from across the globe could recuperate, exchange tactics, forge new identities, and plan their next operations. The primary couriers in this underworld network were Libyan diplomats. Exploiting diplomatic immunity, they used their embassies as transshipment hubs, smuggling not only forged documents but millions in cash, arsenals of weapons, and tons of Semtex plastic explosive in their diplomatic pouches. The IRA alone received over $12 million in cash, alongside thousands of assault rifles, machine guns, and nearly 6 tons of explosives. The devastating impact of this Libyan supply line echoed far beyond the battlefield, deeply scarring Western culture. The iconic 1994 rock anthem, Zombie by the Irish band The Cranberries, was written by lead singer Dolores O'Riordan in direct response to an IRA bombing that killed 2 young boys. The explosive used in that tragedy, like so many others, was Libyan Semtex. Western intelligence agencies were fully aware of Gaddafi's machinations, yet they remained paralyzed. The colonel controlled the spigot of high-quality, sweet crude oil flowing into Europe. Provoking him risked another devastating oil embargo and global economic chaos. Furthermore, assassinating him posed an unacceptable risk of destabilizing a major oil-producing nation. It was simply easier to tolerate the madness and settle for loud, performative condemnations, such as American President Ronald Reagan famously branding Gaddafi the mad dog of the Middle East. While the world watched, European nations continued their lucrative business as usual with Tripoli. This diplomatic immunity allowed Gaddafi to cultivate a romanticized self-image as a noble desert knight defending the world's oppressed. An avid equestrian, he frequently hosted horse races at his sprawling compound, but on the night of April 5, 1986, the knight rode too far. At roughly 2 o'clock in the morning, the La Belle discotheque in West Berlin was packed with nearly 500 patrons, many of them off-duty American soldiers. A nail bomb detonated beneath the DJ booth, killing 2 American servicemen and a Turkish waitress, and wounding 229 others. American intelligence immediately intercepted communications between Tripoli and the Libyan embassy in East Berlin, confirming the operation had been carried out successfully without leaving a trace. The bomb had been assembled by the wife of a Libyan agent using explosives smuggled by those same diplomats. Gaddafi had miscalculated. He failed to realize that the Reagan administration was prepared to back up its mad dog rhetoric with devastating military force. 10 days later, American bombers launched Operation El Dorado Canyon, raining explosives down on military targets in Tripoli and Benghazi. The primary target was Gaddafi's own Bab al-Azizia compound. While the airstrikes failed to kill the colonel, they resulted in dozens of civilian casualties, including the death of his 15-month-old adopted daughter, Hannah. Hannah immediately became a state martyr and a symbol of American imperialism, while Gaddafi cast himself as the ultimate victim. Retreating into the shadows, the colonel began plotting an even more catastrophic revenge. According to his son, Saif al-Islam, Gaddafi was so deeply shaken by the 1986 bombing that he entirely gave up horseback riding. He would not sit on a horse again until after the skies over Lockerbie rained fire. Chapter 6. Night Stars in Black Puddles. Almost 3 years after American warplanes struck Tripoli, the quiet skies over the Scottish town of Lockerbie were violently torn apart just days before Christmas. Residents on the ground later recounted the sheer horror of fiery debris raining down upon their homes. A passenger Boeing had exploded mid-flight, claiming the lives of all 259 people on board, along with 11 locals crushed by the falling wreckage. The debris field scattered across more than 800 square miles. To this day, it remains the deadliest terrorist attack in British history, and prior to September 11th, the most devastating assault on Western civilians in the modern era. The ensuing investigation was a monumental undertaking that spanned 3 years, involving 15,000 interrogations and the cataloguing of over 180,000 pieces of evidence. The conclusion was undeniable. A bomb packed with Libyan Semtex had been detonated in the cargo hold. The blast punched a hole the size of a basketball through the fuselage, an impact more than sufficient at cruising altitude to rip the massive aircraft to shreds in seconds. Investigators eventually identified 2 Libyan intelligence officers as the culprits. Naturally, Colonel Gaddafi refused to acknowledge any involvement and adamantly denied extradition requests. However, the geopolitical landscape of 1992 was vastly different from the golden era of the 1970s. Gaddafi could no longer act with impunity for 3 crucial reasons. First, his oil leverage had evaporated. Following the paralyzing price shocks of 1973, the West had aggressively diversified its energy portfolio, ramping up domestic production and deepening ties with Persian Gulf states. The Libyan spigot was no longer exclusive. Second, the Soviet Union had collapsed, stripping Tripoli of its powerful communist shield. Finally, the unprecedented scale of the bloodshed on European soil demanded a crushing, unified response. The United Nations Security Council unleashed a wave of crippling sanctions, reducing Libya's roaring river of petrodollars to a desperate trickle. The agonizing economic pressure eventually broke the regime's resolve. 11 years after the Lockerbie bombing, Gaddafi surrendered the 2 officers. One was acquitted due to insufficient evidence, while the other received a life sentence. By 2003, Libya officially accepted state responsibility for the attack and paid nearly $3 billion in reparations to the victims' families. The diplomatic phrasing was meticulously crafted to admit that state assets were used without directly implicating the colonel himself. It was only years later, after the regime finally collapsed, that Gaddafi's own former justice minister confessed the dictator had personally ordered the bombing. Tragically, Lockerbie was not an isolated incident. Less than a year later, a French passenger airliner exploded over the Saharan desert, killing 170 innocent people. Once again, the trail of evidence led directly back to Tripoli. Years later, French courts would convict 6 Libyan intelligence operatives in absentia, including Gaddafi's own brother-in-law and intelligence chief. Libya was forced to pay $170 million in compensation. The prevailing theory suggests that Gaddafi ordered the destruction of an entire commercial airliner simply to assassinate a single political dissident travelling on that flight. Gaddafi pursued any hint of opposition with ruthless paranoia, a fear fueled by actual recurring plots against his life. From the very first mutiny, just 3 months into his reign in 1969, to a brazen assault on his compound in 1984, every attempt on his life triggered massive waves of violent repression. The darkest monument to this brutality was Abu Salim Prison, a sprawling complex in Tripoli designed to swallow the regime's enemies whole. Among Libyans, a grim proverb circulated: "Whoever enters Abu Salim is considered dead, whoever leaves is born again." Inside, inmates were subjected to systemic torture, suffocating overcrowding, dysentery, and starvation. In June of 1996, the desperate prisoners of Abu Salim mutinied, demanding nothing more than basic rations, medical care, and family visitation rights. The regime dispatched Gaddafi's brother-in-law, intelligence chief Abdullah Sanusi, to negotiate. Sanusi promised to meet their demands under the condition that they release a hostage guard. The prisoners complied. The moment the guard was safe, the inmates were herded into the prison courtyard, and the slaughter continued for hours. Human rights organizations estimate that 1,270 men were executed that day. Their bodies were initially buried within the prison grounds, only to be exhumed months later, their bones crushed into dust and scattered into the Mediterranean Sea. While this might sound like an exaggerated myth, designed to vilify a dictator, the Libyan government officially admitted to the mass execution in 2004. By that point, Gaddafi had held absolute power for 35 years, spending the last decade as an international pariah devoid of political leverage. His economy was crumbling and domestic unemployment was surging. The colonel could clearly see his potential fate reflected in the televised capture of Saddam Hussein. Furthermore, the Bush administration had recently delivered an unequivocal ultimatum: abandon your clandestine nuclear weapons program, or we will dismantle it for you. Faced with total ruin, the staunch anti-Western revolutionary, a man who had spent decades funding global terror, abruptly pivoted. He turned toward his lifelong enemies, extended a hand, and sued for peace. Chapter 7. The Diplomat. In geopolitics, there is a recurring sleight of hand that never fails to astound. Yesterday's absolute pariah is today's indispensable partner. The key to this transformation is simply being useful at precisely the right moment. It is a well-worn playbook. In 1972, Richard Nixon shook hands with Mao Zedong, a man America had deemed public enemy number one for 2 decades. In 1983, a White House envoy embraced Saddam Hussein because a well-armed Iraq was highly advantageous to Washington's ongoing proxy war against Iran. By the late 1990s, Muammar Gaddafi and his nation were profoundly exhausted. A decade of crippling United Nations sanctions had driven Libya into an economic dead end. The country's vital petroleum infrastructure was decaying, oil production stagnated, and the gross domestic product, while technically growing, moved at a glacial pace. Libya was sitting atop the largest oil reserves on the African continent, but was entirely isolated from the global market. Gaddafi concluded it was time to break the siege. He had very few cards to play, but he played them masterfully. His first major concession was finally surrendering the intelligence agents responsible for the Lockerbie bombing. Following that, he made a stunning public declaration. Libya would entirely dismantle its clandestine nuclear weapons program. This was a profoundly bitter pill for the colonel to swallow. For decades, he had desperately chased the atomic bomb. He had pleaded with China, offered to wipe out $15 billion of India's national debt in exchange for a weapon, and haggled relentlessly with Pakistan, all to no avail. Refusing to concede, he eventually turned to the international black market, securing everything down to the literal blueprints for a nuclear device. He later admitted that in his younger, revolutionary days, he was obsessed with acquiring the bomb, but as the geopolitical landscape shifted, he realized it was a useless endeavor that only brought isolation. In December 2003, Gaddafi officially folded his hand. He declared he was surrendering all nuclear materials, chemical weapons, and ballistic missiles. The regime welcomed us from the International Atomic Energy Agency, and within 6 months, the Libyan nuclear program was completely dismantled. Experts later estimated that Gaddafi was perhaps 7 years away from actually building a functional bomb. For Washington, this capitulation was a spectacular, unearned victory. The Bush administration had just launched a massive invasion of Iraq, hunting for weapons of mass destruction that, as history proved, did not exist. Simultaneously, the leader of a known rogue state voluntarily handed over a verifiable arsenal without a single shot fired. The sanctions were immediately lifted, and the stage was set for a parade of European leaders, driven by one overwhelmingly pragmatic motivation: oil. During the years Libya was cordoned off, the global price of crude had tripled. Every Western nation was desperate for access to millions of barrels of high-quality, sweet Libyan crude located just a few days' sail from European ports. Furthermore, the global landscape of terrorism had fundamentally changed. The IRA had signed the Good Friday Agreement and laid down their arms. Yasser Arafat had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Basque separatists were effectively neutralized. The era of global chaos that Gaddafi had gleefully sponsored was fading into history. Western politicians literally lined up outside Gaddafi's tent, eager to secure lucrative contracts. After 11 years of using the stick, it was time for the carrot, and every leader wanted the first bite. British Prime Minister Tony Blair led the charge. In March 2004, he touched down in Tripoli, strode into Gaddafi's famous Bedouin tent, and emerged flashing a broad smile, enthusiastically proclaiming a wonderful new business partnership. What those smiling photographs failed to capture, however, was the grim price of that partnership. Just days before Blair's arrival, the British intelligence agency MI6 actively assisted the CIA in kidnapping a prominent Libyan dissident and his pregnant wife in Malaysia, rendering them directly back to Gaddafi's torture chambers. The damning documentation of this operation would remain buried until 2011, when rebel forces stormed an intelligence headquarters and uncovered faxes sent by MI6. Following Blair's historic visit, French President Nicolas Sarkozy arrived in Tripoli in 2007. He did not come empty-handed. He brought sweeping contracts to construct a nuclear reactor, modernize the Libyan military, and sell advanced fighter jets. In December of that same year, Gaddafi returned the favour, travelling to Paris and pitching his massive Bedouin tent directly on the manicured lawns of the Élysée Palace. French newspapers like Le Monde furiously criticised Sarkozy for grovelling before a dictator, but the president simply brushed off the criticism. Years later, multiple investigations revealed the likely reason for his compliance. Gaddafi had allegedly funneled tens of millions of euros into Sarkozy's 2007 election campaign, a staggering scandal that would haunt the French politician long after the colonel's demise. However, Gaddafi's most enthusiastic European ally was unequivocally Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. A man who treated political scandals with the same casual air as his beloved AC Milan football victories, Berlusconi found a kindred spirit in the colonel. Both men were notoriously flamboyant, obsessed with luxury, and openly embraced excess. In 2008, Berlusconi travelled to Benghazi to sign a comprehensive friendship and cooperation treaty. It was during this trip that the infamous photograph was taken showing the Italian Prime Minister leaning down to kiss the hand of his Libyan counterpart, a gesture the colonel received with visible indifference. Under the treaty, Italy pledged $5 billion in compensation for the atrocities of the colonial era. In exchange, Gaddafi promised to ruthlessly stem the flow of African migrants across the Mediterranean, while simultaneously awarding Italy massive, highly lucrative oil concessions. Emboldened by his rehabilitation, the Libyan leader embarked on a global victory lap. In 2008, he travelled to the Kremlin to negotiate arms and gas deals, then on to Rome, where he pitched his tent in the historic Villa Doria Pamphili Park. From there he travelled to Brussels, hosting European diplomats inside his mobile fortress. Every international trip Gaddafi took was a meticulously crafted spectacle. During his time in Rome, he famously used a high-end modelling agency to recruit 500 attractive, elegantly dressed women. Each was paid a small fee to attend a reception. Rather than the scandalous debauchery many anticipated, the colonel spent 2 hours lecturing the women on the virtues of Islam, handing out copies of the Quran alongside his Green Book, and urging them all to convert. Yet for all his grandstanding, Gaddafi's world tours were severely hampered by bizarre, crippling phobias. American diplomats noted that the brotherly leader was terrified of heights, refusing to sleep above the first floor or climb more than 35 steps at a time. He was also profoundly afraid of flying over open water. Consequently, his international flights had to be absurdly fragmented, hopping over land masses for no more than 8 hours at a time, forcing his exhausted entourage to endure endless layovers. Despite the restored oil flow and the diplomatic handshakes, Gaddafi was fundamentally dissatisfied. Now in his 60s, he reflected on his legacy. The grand pan-Arab unification he dreamed of in the 70s had entirely failed. He had been rejected by his Arab peers, and he knew his newfound Western allies only tolerated him for his resources. There was only one direction left to turn: south. To understand Gaddafi's pivot towards sub-Saharan Africa in the 2000s, one must grasp the persistent, suffocating grip of neocolonialism. Consider this analogy. Imagine you are given the deed to an apartment. The walls are yours, but the previous owner still secretly controls your utilities, dictates your renovation budget, and stations his own private security guard in your lobby, who occasionally locks you out. This was the economic reality for much of Africa at the dawn of the 21st century. While formal empires had dissolved, the economic tentacles of the former colonizers remained deeply entrenched. France, in particular, maintained an extraordinary hold over its former colonies through the CFA franc, a currency heavily regulated by the French treasury. It was an economic system that forced developing nations to surrender massive portions of their national reserves to a foreign power, severely stunting their financial sovereignty. Gaddafi accurately diagnosed this system as modern financial slavery, cloaked in diplomatic smiles and unequal trade agreements. The colonel also recognized a grim historical pattern. African leaders who attempted to fundamentally alter this parasitic relationship rarely lived long enough to see their reforms through. When the leader of the Congo attempted to nationalize resources, he was swiftly overthrown and assassinated, an outcome heavily influenced by Western intelligence. When the leader of Burkina Faso sought to break his nation's dependence on Western debt, he was gunned down. Yet dictators who remained compliant with Western economic interests were allowed to rule for decades, richly rewarded with foreign aid and military hardware. Having been snubbed by the Arab world and inherently distrustful of the West, Gaddafi decided it was time to build a new empire, this time across the African continent. He utilized his most effective weapon, his checkbook. Petrodollars flooded southward, funding massive infrastructure projects, mosques, and hospitals across impoverished nations. While his motives were undeniably self-serving, some of his initiatives were genuinely transformative. For instance, Gaddafi financed the launch of Africa's very first independent communications satellite. Prior to this, the continent was forced to pay European corporations roughly $500 million annually simply for satellite access. His economic vision grew even bolder. He proposed the creation of an African Monetary Fund, an independent institution designed to replace the predatory lending practices of the International Monetary Fund. He also championed the gold dinar, a pan-African currency backed entirely by gold reserves, which would have severely undermined the dominance of the US dollar and the euro in the region. The zenith of his African project arrived in 2008. Gaddafi summoned 200 African kings, sultans, tribal chiefs, and heads of state to a grand summit. Dressed in opulent traditional robes, he was formally crowned the King of Kings of Africa. Standing before the assembly, he delivered an impassioned visionary speech calling for a United States of Africa, complete with a single unified military, a shared currency, a single passport, and naturally, one supreme leader. The audience applauded politely, but not a single leader signed on to his grand vision. The underlying problem with a unified Africa was glaringly obvious. While many nations desired unity, Every individual autocrat wanted to be the central authority. Gaddafi was no exception. He did not want to unite the continent as much as he wanted to subjugate it beneath his own authority. Ultimately, the historical irony was profound. The young idealistic revolutionary who seized power in 1969 by overthrowing an aging king, condemning him as a corrupt aristocratic traitor to the people, had ultimately transformed into a monarch himself, ruling with an opulence and arrogance that King Idris could never have imagined. Chapter 8. Emperor of the Amazons, stepping away from the grand theatre of geopolitics. The private life of Muammar Gaddafi was every bit as eccentric and surreal as his public persona. In his early years, he dressed the part of a traditional military strongman, donning the crisp uniforms and peaked caps favoured by figures like Augusto Pinochet or a young Saddam Hussein. However, as the decades passed, the colonel's wardrobe grew increasingly flamboyant. Military drab gave way to vibrant African tunics, flowing robes embroidered with the continent's map, and by the 2000s he was regularly seen adorned in gold buttons, designer sunglasses, elaborate turbans, and heavy medallions. His famous Bedouin tent was outfitted with the unrestrained extravagance of a man who possessed a bottomless treasury. It was in reality a portable palace complete with Persian carpets, satellite dishes, and central heating and air conditioning. Gaddafi justified this opulence by claiming he was a simple son of the desert, mocking those who slept in concrete boxes. For the colonel, the tent was a symbol of his nomadic identity. For everyone else, it was a glaring sign that the Libyan leader was living in an entirely alternate reality. He spared no expense for his personal comfort. When attending a summit in Belgrade, he arrived with 2 horses and 6 camels, which were grazed directly outside his luxury hotel, simply to ensure he had a constant supply of fresh camel milk. He adored the rich, slightly salty beverage, a luxury that today would cost dozens of dollars just for a small powdered mix online. Yet, despite his vast wealth, Gaddafi's personal diet remained remarkably ascetic. While he hosted foreign dignitaries with lavish banquets, he personally subsisted on simple dates and unleavened bread, the austere staples of his childhood. Gaddafi was married twice. His first union lasted less than a year, but his second marriage endured for the rest of his life, producing 6 sons and 1 daughter. While he publicly rejected polygamy, his wife had ample reason for jealousy. The colonel was famously flanked by his Amazonian guard, a security detail of up to 400 young women dressed in camouflage, wearing heels, and carrying automatic weapons. Gaddafi publicly championed the guard as a symbol of female empowerment, while security analysts speculated it was a calculated psychological tactic, as armed men might hesitate to fire upon women. However, the progressive facade masked a horrifying reality. Following his downfall, dozens of witnesses revealed that the basement of his compound functioned as a literal harem, where the dictator subjected his female guards to systemic abuse and de facto slavery. Ironically, the one-woman Gaddafi openly obsessed over remained entirely out of his reach: former United States Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. When they met in Tripoli in 2008, Gaddafi hosted her with a level of staggering opulence that exceeded even his own standards. The true depth of his infatuation was only uncovered in 2011, when rebel forces stormed his compound and discovered a meticulously curated scrapbook filled entirely with photographs of the American diplomat. Gaddafi fathered 8 children, but a few key heirs defined the family's turbulent legacy. Mohammed, his eldest from his first marriage, managed Libya's telecommunications and largely avoided the political spotlight. Aisha, the colonel's favourite, was a Sorbonne-educated lawyer who famously joined the international defence team for Saddam Hussein and was dubbed the Claudia Schiffer of North Africa for her glamorous appearance. Saadi followed in his father's footsteps as an army colonel, but harboured dreams of professional soccer. Leveraging Libya's massive wealth, he bought his way onto the roster of the Italian club Perugia, playing a single match in the 2003-2004 season, securing a photo op with soccer legend Alessandro Del Piero, and promptly failing a drug test. Hannibal Gaddafi, meanwhile, was the quintessential spoiled aristocrat, making international headlines for racing a Porsche with diplomatic plates down the Champs-Élysées in Paris and brutally assaulting hotel staff in Geneva. Finally, there was Saif al-Islam, the second son and presumed heir apparent. Armed with a degree from the London School of Economics, tailored suits and fluent English, he presented himself as a sophisticated reformer. Western diplomats viewed him with cautious optimism, believing he would be the civilized, modern leader Libya desperately needed. Yet, when the revolution erupted in 2011, the Western veneer instantly vanished. Saif al-Islam appeared on state television and ruthlessly promised to drown the rebellion in rivers of blood, proving that protecting the family dynasty superseded any pretense of democratic reform. The entire Gaddafi clan resided in Bab al-Azizia, a sprawling fortress in southern Tripoli. Encompassing nearly 2.5 square miles behind massive walls, the compound featured a personal bunker, a 2-story family mansion, a mosque, military barracks, a soccer field, 2 tennis courts, lush gardens, a swimming pool, a massive gymnasium, and, naturally, the camel tent. Rumours persisted that, much like the infamous drug lord El Chapo, Gaddafi had constructed a 30-mile subterranean tunnel network stretching all the way to the coast. The fortress also housed 2 fully equipped surgical suites. In his early 50s, Gaddafi covertly flew in Brazilian plastic surgeons for facelifts, hair transplants, and liposuction. He later explained that, having ruled for decades, he refused to let the youth of Libya see their revolutionary leader age into a feeble old man. As the year 2010 drew to a close, Gaddafi entered his 5th decade of absolute power. Having ruled for 41 years, he was the longest-serving leader on the African continent. He had survived coups, assassination attempts, crippling international sanctions, and Western bombing campaigns. He had seamlessly transitioned from an unpredictable rogue state to public enemy number 1, and finally into a tolerated business partner. It seemed inevitable that he would remain entrenched in his fortress until his final breath. Everything changed in the obscure Tunisian town of Sidi Bouzid, when local authorities confiscated the vegetable cart of an impoverished street vendor, his sole source of income. He sought justice at the local municipal office. Instead of help, he was beaten and turned away. In a profound act of despair, he stepped into the street and set himself on fire. Within a month, the Tunisian regime collapsed. A month after that, massive protests engulfed Egypt, quickly spreading to Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, Jordan, and Algeria. This wave of revolution, soon to be known as the Arab Spring, violently rattled regimes that had stood unchallenged for decades. Watching from his fortified compound in Tripoli, Gaddafi remained supremely confident. He convinced himself he was immune to the chaos. He was not merely a Tunisian president who had ruled for a paltry 23 years, nor was he the Egyptian leader abandoned by his own military in just 18 days. He was the King of Kings. He had never been more catastrophically wrong. Chapter 9. 247 days. Across the Middle East and North Africa, the Arab Spring was ignited by distinct, localized catalysts, events that pushed simmering tensions past the point of no return. In Libya, the spark was the arrest of a prominent human rights attorney who represented the families of those massacred at Abu Salim prison. Naturally, the underlying causes of the uprising were profoundly complex, rooted in severe regional inequality, deep-seated tribal resentments, and a staggering 30% youth unemployment rate in a nation overflowing with oil wealth. What began as a localized protest rapidly escalated. The day after the attorney's arrest, hundreds took to the streets. Security forces initially attempted to disperse the crowds with rubber bullets, but as the demonstrations swelled into the thousands, they switched to live ammunition. Yet the people kept returning, their numbers multiplying with each passing day. The very scenario Muammar Gaddafi had spent his life fearing had finally materialized. The populace had become so enraged that they completely stripped him of his aura as the untouchable leader of the revolution. By February 21st, rebel forces captured the eastern stronghold of Benghazi. The regime's foundation began to fracture. Soldiers defected to the opposition, loyal generals abruptly resigned, and diplomats abandoned their posts. Within a single week, the colonel lost control of half the country, yet he stubbornly refused to surrender. On February 22nd, Gaddafi delivered a defiant televised address from the ruins of the very compound the Americans had bombed in 1986. He vowed never to abandon the soil where his grandfather was buried, prophetically declaring that he would die as a martyr alongside him. By March, Gaddafi rallied his remaining forces and launched a brutal counteroffensive. His tanks rolled eastward toward Benghazi, while his air force bombarded rebel-held cities. This violent escalation provided Western powers with the precise geopolitical opening they had been waiting for. On March 17th, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973. Stripped of diplomatic jargon, the resolution effectively authorized a Western bombing campaign against Libya. The United States, Great Britain and Italy were soon joined by Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, nations that were far from democratic but harbored deep, unresolved grievances against the colonel. Gaddafi was suddenly trapped. His fractured military could not possibly withstand the overwhelming might of the international coalition. The very same European partners who had recently embraced him were now actively hunting him. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair privately urged Gaddafi to flee the country immediately. French President Nicolas Sarkozy, however, took a far more aggressive stance. The man who had rolled out the red carpet for the dictator at the LIC Palace just 3 years prior now personally spearheaded the bombing campaign, with French fighter jets delivering the first strikes on Libyan soil. This aggressive pivot was inextricably linked to allegations that Gaddafi had illegally funneled €50 million into Sarkozy's election campaign. In European politics, accepting illicit campaign funds from a dictator is not merely a scandal. It is a fatal blow to a political career. Sarkozy was acutely aware of the secrets Gaddafi held, but his preemptive strike ultimately offered no salvation. French courts would later sentence the former president to prison, marking the first time a modern French head of state received a custodial sentence, though he served the time under judicial supervision. By the summer of 2011, not a single international ally stood by Gaddafi. Even his closest confidant, the head of Libyan intelligence, defected to London. The noose was tightening, yet the colonel refused to yield. While the coalition remained hesitant to commit ground troops, Gaddafi still nominally controlled portions of the country and attempted to negotiate terms. His overtures were met with silence. Instead, a coalition bomb levelled the home of his youngest son, killing him alongside 3 of Gaddafi's grandchildren. When the Arab League itself formally requested a no-fly zone over Libya, the final pillar of his regime crumpled. The absolute authority he had painstakingly built over half a century collapsed with breathtaking speed. Backed by NATO air support, rebel forces stormed Tripoli. Within 3 days, they breached Gaddafi's fortified compound, only to find the dictator had vanished. Gaddafi initially hid in safe houses across the capital before fleeing to his coastal hometown of Sirte. Accompanied by a few of his sons and dozens of loyal bodyguards, he declared Sirte the new capital of his fractured nation. For 2 agonizing months, the city endured a brutal siege until it was entirely depleted of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Witnesses later recounted that the colonel's mental state wildly fluctuated during those final days, alternating between quiet, resigned prayer and manic episodes where he screamed at his men to launch impossible counterattacks. On October 20th, the 247th day of the Civil War, Gaddafi's inner circle finally convinced him it was time to run. At dawn, a heavily armed convoy of 70 vehicles broke from the city, carrying Gaddafi, 2 of his sons, his defense minister, and his remaining guards. They made a desperate dash toward the southern desert, hoping to reach loyalist safe havens in Niger. They did not make it 2 miles. From a sterile control room in the Nevada desert, 6,000 miles away, American drone operators tracked their every move after intercepting a critical phone call. The coordinates were relayed to French fighter pilots, who unleashed a devastating strike on the convoy, obliterating 11 vehicles. Miraculously, Gaddafi survived the blast. Bleeding and disoriented, he sought refuge inside a concrete drainage pipe beneath the highway. Within an hour, rebel fighters from Misrata, a city that had suffered unspeakable atrocities at the hands of Gaddafi's forces, descended upon the wreckage. At 9:30 in the morning, the brotherly leader and guide of the revolution was dragged from the mud, delivered directly into the hands of the very people who despised him most. The horrific events that followed were meticulously documented on the shaky cell phone cameras of the frenzied mob. The brutal 3-hour lynching of the former dictator requires no further embellishment. Yet, even among those whose lives had been shattered by his regime, the spectacle elicited a complex reaction. The brother of a victim from the Lockerbie bombing later noted that he watched the footage, hoping to feel a sense of righteous vengeance, but ultimately felt only a strange, hollow pity for the broken man pleading for his life. Eventually, Gaddafi's lifeless body was loaded into the back of a pickup truck and transported to Misrata. In a final, macabre indignity, his corpse was placed on public display inside a commercial meat freezer at a local shopping centre, laid alongside the bodies of his son and his defence minister. For 4 days, thousands of Libyans and international journalists stood in mile-long lines to view the remains. On October 25th, the bodies were secretly driven deep into the desert and buried in an unmarked grave, its location guarded to this day. Thus ended the 42-year reign of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. In the aftermath, the nation he left behind spiraled into chaos. Vengeful militias desecrated the graves of his ancestors. His surviving children faced equally grim fates. 3 sons were killed in the conflict. Saadi, the former soccer player, served a lengthy prison sentence before fleeing to Turkey. Aisha found asylum in Oman, and his widow sought refuge in Cairo. The dynasty that once owned a nation was scattered to the winds. The vast Gaddafi fortune, estimated at nearly $200 billion in 2011, largely vanished. While international authorities froze approximately $97 billion, the rest evaporated like a forgotten $20 bill, left in the pocket of an old winter coat. Much of it was looted in the fog of war, while UN experts suspect Gaddafi may have smuggled up to $80 billion in gold, diamonds, and cash into neighbouring African nations shortly before his death. Treasure hunters and mercenaries chase those ghost billions to this day. Libya itself descended into a seemingly endless civil war, a relentless battle for control of its oil wealth. What was once the most prosperous nation in Africa was reduced to a humanitarian catastrophe characterized by shattered infrastructure, a ruined economy, thousands dead, and hundreds of thousands displaced. Adjusted for inflation, the current per capita income has plummeted to levels not seen since the year before Gaddafi seized power. The bitter irony of the revolution is, perhaps best summarized by the fate of the Libyan dissident who had been rendered to Gaddafi by Western intelligence. After being released through a de-radicalization program spearheaded by Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, that same dissident ultimately led the rebel assault on the dictator's compound. He later took up residence in a 5-star hotel suite previously owned by the very son who had freed him. Saif al-Islam, who had cultivated the image of a Western-leaning reformer before promising rivers of blood during the uprising, ultimately outlived his father by more than a decade. Operating from the shadows near Tripoli since his release from militia captivity in 2017, his story came to a violent end in February 2026, when unknown gunmen stormed his residence and assassinated the 53-year-old heir. Throughout his life, Gaddafi loved to proclaim himself a Bedouin, a son of the desert. His iconic tent was his calling card, a defiant symbol broadcast to the world that he was fundamentally different from Western diplomats. Yet a Bedouin is, above all, a nomad. Nomads do not build lasting foundations. They construct temporary shelters, pitch their tents, live within them, and when they inevitably move on, they leave virtually no trace behind. For 42 years, Muammar Gaddafi did not build a modern state. He built a tent. It was an impossibly grand golden tent erected over millions of people, propped up by geysers of oil and an intricate system entirely dependent on a single man. It was a magnificent structure, but it was inherently temporary, destined to stand only as long as its master remained inside. In October 2011, the master was gone. The tent collapsed, leaving behind only the harsh, unforgiving desert, punctuated by a few isolated oases, the desert that had always been there. If you followed the rise and fall of today's subject with interest or concern, please share this documentary. Engaging with our content ensures these complex histories reach a wider audience,